Welcome back to Irish Stew. I'm John Lee. Flying solo today as Martin Nutty is back in the motherland. Our focus now is on producing Fresh Stew Live with Terry Galway, author of the new Terror from America, a Sherlock Holmes adventure, where Terry as the great detective traveling to New York in 1885 to infiltrate Fenian gangs working to blow up London, or at least symbolic parts of it. It's a live recording session with an actual paying audience on June 1st with fiddler Eileen McLean and actor Mick Malamphy to help us set the mood. And 2 weeks out, the show is already sold out. With this event looming and Martin away, we decided to reprise our December giving season episode with Sean Granahan, CEO of the Floating Hospital, a charity that would have served the basic health needs of those same folks in that Fenian world Terry Galway describes, and all the other migrants crowding into New York at that time. And its work continues to this day, ever more vital. The Floating Hospital's big event is the day after ours on June 2nd. It's Summer Gala 2026, celebrating its 160th year. There's still time to be part of the Floating Hospital story. Just go to thefloatinghospital.org for information on their gala and other ways to support this great cause. So again, let's shine our light on the Floating Hospital on the cusp of their signature event. So Sean Granahan, welcome to Irish Stew.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
We were working on scheduling this episode for a long time, so glad to be off to the races with you here. Let's start off with some news. Today's November 13th when we're recording this. Yesterday you made some headlines with an important announcement about the Floating Hospital. What's the backstory there?
So the backstory is that a very large grant opportunity called Action for Women's Health became available. It is a $250 million global initiative to help women on very specific health issues related exclusively to women. And so the majority of the Floating Hospital's patients are young mothers and their children. So we felt we should give it a try, which we did. It was a very interesting application process. It included a video component. It included different peer reviews that we had to do on other applicants. And it was a global opportunity, but essentially it was like lotto. It was like playing scratch tickets at the local bodega. You try it and what the heck? So that's essentially the approach we took was, we'll try it and what the heck. We ended up being one of 80 global recipients of an award. In our particular case, only 33 of the 80 were awarded to organizations in the United States. So globally, we were essentially one of 80, but really one of 33 in the US. And so there were 4,000 applicants throughout the globe that applied for this particular opportunity. And so it was a big deal. It's a transformational grant in the sense that the grant funding awards ranged from $1 million to $5 million. And so for us, it was huge. It was a huge help for the type of charity work we do. More importantly, it was a recognition of the kind of work that we do, which is based on an essential kindness and holistic approach to families.
We pick up that word of kindness as we were looking into this. Let's just give the listeners a 30-second pitch, if you have it in you, as to what the Floating Hospital is. And then we'll find out more about the story as we go along.
Today, the Floating Hospital, just like it did when it was founded directly after the Civil War, think of the Floating Hospital as a three-legged stool. So when you're treating the poorest populations in the city, you take care of their immediate needs, you take care of their health education so that they can understand what it is you're trying to do for them, and you provide them with some form of health care. So that three-legged stool has been consistent with us for 16 decades. Next year is our 160th.
Yeah, that's extraordinary. We certainly want to probe more of that history, but before we do that, we want to understand a bit about you and your Irish identity. You told me before we switch the record button that you're from Pennsylvania. And your last name is Granahan, which is not a hugely populous name in Ireland. Now, I'm not one to criticize with my last name, but tell me, how do you understand your whole Irish thing? Pennsylvania is a hugely Irish state in the United States, and so you're part of that.
I have to say first that I do find it offensive that I can go online and look for various Irish heralds and all kinds of coats of arms and stuff, and I can never find one for Granahan for reasons that are clearly wrong in the whole universe. That said, family history, family lore would put us on the west side, Mayo, and in that particular region, and Ancestry has confirmed that, but on the same token, it's put a good chunk of our DNA out in Dublin, in Leinster.
Yeah, Leinster is one of the 4 Irish provinces, and I'm delighted to hear you have Dublin DNA because there's no better place as far as I'm concerned. But despite your Mayo origins, you're by trade a lawyer, as I understand it. Now, you're working for a substantial not-for-profit. There are far bigger ones, but there's many smaller ones. Have you disappointed your parents by not doing lawyerly things and making god-awful amounts of money? How did you get there?
I did do lawyerly things. So I'm a regulatory lawyer by trade. I worked for a federal judge, a very Irish federal judge, a Nealon, in Pennsylvania for 2 years. And then I went into long-haul trucking and warehousing. And I was an in-house lawyer for large warehouse and trucking organizations, and finally came out in 1996 to Epstein, Becker and Green, which is basically a corporate law firm, business law firm. So I did assignments for everything from Tropicana to MTV, Viacom, Verizon, and then eventually ended up working as a senior lawyer on the dispute between Larry Silverstein and his insurers in the collapse of the Twin Towers on 9/11. And so what's interesting about that is at the day on 9/11, there was no property insurance policy in place. There was money had been exchanged, but not language, not policy language. And I was one of the few attorneys in the firm who understood stacked insurance and how stacked insurance worked. So I was tapped to help prep the broker, Willis, on the World Trade Center litigation. So I did that for 2+ years. In the interim, we also had a healthcare department. And so some of us crossed out of the business category per se, and we helped occasionally on assignments for hospitals. And since hospitals never had any money to pay their bills, it was considered free. And the floating hospital was my pro bono client. And so after the World Trade Center case got packaged and sent off, I decided to leave the firm and I was going to go back in-house. And I hadn't really thought about healthcare as the place to go, but I knew all the people there at this point. They really needed somebody more on a volunteer basis. So I went there first as a volunteer and then got sucked into the whole, oh, we need you for this, we need you for that. Can you run HR? Can you do this? Can you do that? So it happened on its own more so than anything else. So I did satisfy my father and worked in a large firm, and he was able to brag about that. And then he was able to brag to his Jesuit priest friends that I left that world after I did all of that fancy stuff and waited. So he got all of his kudos out of this in the end. He was very happy.
If you'd stayed in the warehousing business, you could have been a gazillionaire at Amazon right now because everything goes through warehouses.
John, when you describe your career to us now, somehow it all makes sense. Tell us a little bit more about the floating hospital. It's no longer floating exactly. We'll get to that, but what are the origins? You alluded to it post-Civil War, but what were the origins and what problem was it looking to solve?
So the history of the floating hospital to me is one of the more fascinating New York stories because it really is a quintessential New York story at the end of the day. So it was actually part of Trinity Church. Trinity Church at that time created guilds, and then the guilds did good works. They helped various groups of people who desperately needed help. New York City was going through one of its rougher periods because right after the draft riots of the early 1860s, and then directly after the Civil War, which is about our period when we were formed in 1866, the collect pond had already been filled in. It already had substandard housing. The substandard housing was collapsing, and waves of two specific populations came together to live next door to each other, right on top of each other. Emancipated blacks and Irish immigrants.
And Sean, this is a topic that's come up repeatedly, the whole draft riot, 5 Points neighborhood.
The floating hospital story is the story of the 5 Points and how the world of what we call the poor expanded across the island and along the shores of the island.
Yeah, just to be clear for our listeners that are maybe not that intimately familiar with New York history, the 5 Points was a notorious part of New York City. It was called as such because it was the intersection of 5 streets in the Lower East Side, primarily populated, or a great deal of the population would have been essentially refugees from the Irish famine. And then other folks, as you said, emancipated African-American people.
And I may mention that Peter Quinn's book, Banished Children of Eve, we interviewed Peter. He wrote, that's what the book was about. And also Larry Kerwin's play, Paradise Square. Paradise Square, that was on Broadway, was about that period. So This is a topic that keeps cropping up for us.
Yeah. And frankly, it should, because it, in a lot of ways, I found when I spoke to the Irish Business Organization about this topic, I was genuinely surprised at how many young Irish potential J1s had no idea that the Irish were considered subhuman, that we were drawn as cartoon characters, as gorillas with knuckles dragging across the pavement. No Irish need apply is a concept that they had never really heard of. And a lot of them came up to me afterwards to talk about that because they were like, are you kidding me?
The slide deck you showed to the IBO, the images of the drunken Irishman, very much simian looking.
Yep.
And I noticed there was this notice about preventing cholera, telling people to abstain above all from ardent spirits.
Yes, absolutely. And in talking a little bit about it, things like TB and consumption were all considered the natural death of the Irish, but they were considered that. If you look at it from a much more detailed perspective, of course they were going to get TB and consumption because there were 60 of them living in a room.
So at that time when people said the natural death of the Irish, was it because those that were promulgating that idea were essentially suggesting that the Irish were somehow inferior and therefore were likely to get tuberculosis?
Two forms, yes. They were inferior because of their living conditions, the way they were viewed as very happily, so to speak, living too close on top of each other in unsanitary conditions. It was like a natural state for them. So therefore, of course, they get TB because they enjoy living like rats in a nest. So it was interesting in that sense. So the hospital's first assignment, so to speak, before it was a hospital, because it wasn't a hospital right away. It was simply the St. John's Guild, and it was designed to provide aid. And so aid was a very broad word. We didn't really have health care in 1866, but we did have cures, so to speak, right? We had like snake oil salesmen, we had treatments, whatever that means. And then we had a very weak first leg of the stool. The second leg of the stool, however, was health education, which was huge back then. So adulterated milk was probably one of the biggest issues for poor families to face. They drank plaster of Paris. They drank lead. They drank anything that looked white.
It was like the swill milk. It came from distilleries, breweries, where the cattle were housed at the brewery and fed the discards of the brewing process and produced a very weak milk.
And so you had to teach them how to recognize proper milk from improper milk. So those were our first kind of adventures in health education, which of course evolved over time to a variety of different things. And then of course the last leg of the stool was in full force, which was providing food, clothes. Literally, the Irish came to America with the clothes on their back. That was it. And so trying to provide them with something warm for the winter, some kind of food to keep them going. And the model at that time was go to them. Don't expect them to come to you. Go find them. Give them what they need. It's a true act of kindness in that sense, and coming from a good place.
Do you find it somewhat odd that we're sitting in this room almost 160 years later, that the mission has not necessarily changed that much? Now, if you look at the present time, you look at that past time, what continues to be the concern of the floating hospital? Is there a thread that you can follow through and say, hey, this is how this idea was expressed back in 1866 when the organization was established, and this is how it's now playing out in 2025?
I would slightly disagree with you and say simply, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed at all in 160 years. We are still faced with mothers and children with nothing. Clothes on their back. I face that every day, no differently than the stewards in the past have faced that.
And is that specifically because New York continues to be one of the most diverse immigrant cities?
It's a magnet.
Function of that, right?
It's a magnet. It continues to be. So we get people from the South. We get people from all over the globe. Queens has 127 different languages floating around at any given time. And at the floating hospital, we have probably fluencies in anywhere from 9 to 15 different languages, just to try to keep pace with who's coming in. You could walk into the floating hospital on a Monday and most of the room will be Spanish. The waiting room will be Spanish. You could walk in on Thursday and most of the waiting room will be Creole. You can walk in 2 weeks later and it'll be Eastern European. So there's no rhyme nor reason to what you'll find in our hospital, because there's always poor and there are always women with no options that either have to leave some form of violence or abuse and find themselves homeless, or they just simply have no alternatives, or they have no family, or they get evicted, or they get tossed out of a family living situation.
Sean, let's go back to what you were talking about, the treatments. And people did their best in terms of the idea of treatments, what was available to them at the time. And one of the treatments seemed to be to get out in the fresh air.
Yes.
And that, I think, is where the idea of the floating hospital, which I don't think we've really explained yet, that part of your story. So let's cast off here.
Sure.
And when did this effort first start?
So floating hospitals came about in 3 waves, essentially. Floating hospitals started during the Revolutionary War, because when you had a contingency and your contingency all of a sudden suffered from smallpox, you had to do something with them, which meant you had to get them away from everyone else. So you stuck them on a ship and you put them out in the water. They survived, they got back off the ship. If they didn't, God bless them, that was that. Burial at sea. And so the origins of floating hospitals are really mass disease based. Right after the Civil War, New York City was a toxic environment. It was fueled by coal. There were over 1 million horses on the bottom half of the island, all going to the bathroom producing methane galore. So it was a stew. The air was really a Tough
Hey,
stew.
wait a minute.
And
Stu.
fine Irish stew.
No, hold on.
Sorry, let me say that again.
Rephrase
It was
that.
more. It was definitely not a stew. It was more of a miasma. It was a toxic one at that. So the wealthy could escape it by just simply going up the island, right, to the northern parts of Manhattan, where that was farmland, or out onto Long Island, or across the river in New Jersey to their nice little comfy farms, and they could escape it. But the poor had no escape. And the fresh air concept really took hold, but where were you going to send them? You had nowhere to send them, per se. So what you had to do was you had to take them, get them somewhere, and then bring them back. The other thing they discovered was that respiratory issues were relieved by salt air, which had long been understood. The thought of getting them out of the miasma and out into the water could help clear their lungs a little bit. So that's really how the floating hospital concept moved from mass disease management to something that was a little bit more curative.
How many floating hospitals have there been under your admiralty?
The hospital had 6 different ships over the years.
Describe a voyage at some point in time. Who would be on it? What would happen to them?
So if you looked at, say, 1900, the carriages would go out in the morning, just like my 12 mini buses go out today. The carriages would go out in the morning. They would hit all of the poor neighborhoods, and they would dole out tickets to the floating hospital. You had to have a ticket to get on the floating hospital. And tickets were big deals. They were commodities. They were manipulated. People wanted to get a hold of those tickets if they were poor. So you would have literally hundreds of moms and kids on the docks. And you would have our floating hospital, and the moms and kids would get up the plank. They would get in the boat. The boat provided several essentials that we don't even think about today. One was a bath. And in 1900, right through the 1920s, a bath was one of the big deals. If you could get there, you would get a bath. The kids would all get a bath. The kids would get real milk rather than adulterated milk, which made a difference. Milk was still, up until the 1950s and 60s, was a mainstay of the floating hospital. So milk was a big issue. They would get fed, and then the moms would have the opportunity to meet with nurses who were really providing health care around 1900 for a doctor. So a doctor would typically screen them for disease. The nurses would take care of them after that. And then really it was about this 3-legged stool. So they would go home with food. They would go home with some clothes if they needed it. They would get spoken to and taught various things to help themselves out when they went back into the slums and the poorer areas. And they would get whatever the equivalent of health care was at the moment.
And they also get lasting memory, a terrific adventure.
Absolutely. And then for some, up until the 1940s, mid-1940s, some of the moms, if there was a recognized serious problem, they would stop in New Dorp on Staten Island, where we had the Seaside Hospital. So we had a seaside physical hospital. So the floating hospital would go to the Seaside Hospital, and the moms and kids would stay there until they were better, and then they would get brought back to the island on the boat.
So the organization went through 6 incarnations of these floating vessels, but now you're no longer floating. You're in Long Island City. And again, just for a point of clarity for our listeners that are not maybe familiar with New York geography, Long Island City is just right across the river from Manhattan, with the epic views of Manhattan as you come over the Queensboro Bridge.
The 59th Street Bridge, the Feeling Groovy Bridge from
Paul Simon.
Yes.
Or the Ed
That
Koch
was
Bridge.
the Ed Koch Bridge. Yeah, it's every bridge, basically.
Yes. As usual, New Yorkers will argue about exactly what a bridge is called. Now you are land-based. Tell us about that transition. What was behind that? Why is the boat no longer important, or is it important?
2 different questions for me. I would say going back to the last day of service for the floating hospital was 9/11. The towers fell, the debris spewed across the bottom part of the island, and we gave everything away, and the vessel was towed to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where we were given a dock so that we could clean it and continue to use it for administrative purposes. But there was going to be too much cleanup on the lower part of the island, and they would not be able to have us back. So we had fundamental decisions that had to be made.
So essentially, you lost your docking place. Is that what you're
docking
describing?
place, and which was
The vessel was damaged as well.
no, the vessel wasn't damaged, but it needed a special kind of cleaning because of the debris, which we were able to do. But there was going to be too much activity around the South Street Seaport area for us to go back there, and the new Bloomberg administration equated us with what most people feel are homelessness, right? So homelessness in New York City is a mom and a kid. If you look at numbers, if you look at statistics and numbers, it's a mom and a kid. But stereotypically, if you say homeless to someone in New York, you're going to think of a panhandler or, God forbid, the guy that throws somebody in front of the train tracks. That's 10 to 20% of the homeless population. The remainder are moms and kids with no drug or mental health issues.
Just to elucidate for our listeners, New York City is a city of something like 9 million people.
Correct.
How big is that homeless population? You refer to the fact that maybe 10% of those are folks with, let's say, substance abuse problems or mental health issues, highly visible homeless. But then you have this much bigger population.
So the easiest way to put it in perspective is to look at the numbers of homeless children in the New York City public school system. Those numbers are anywhere from 115 to 140,000. The population of Albany is under 100,000, total population of Albany, including adults. There's basically more homeless kids in the New York City school system than there are bodies in Albany, that is our state capital.
And it sounds the way you framed your answer that you're extrapolating. It's not like anybody has a really vigorous and hard count of where we're at.
Yeah, you can't, because the homeless moms and kids come from essentially several well-established buckets, right? We'll call them buckets. The first bucket is foster care. So young women at age 18 age out of foster care, and their options are typically the street. And so that's a problem in New York City. So homeless moms come from foster care. They come from evictions. And evictions can take a couple of forms. They could either be an apartment with generational poverty contained within it. So take, for instance, a grandmother who has a NYCHA apartment, which is public housing, and she might have 3 generations living under her roof. And then one of the granddaughters comes home with yet another baby, and they get thrown out, just simply because there's too many bodies in the place. That's a common issue in our world. And frankly, domestic violence is a massive producer of homeless moms and kids. It's probably 50 to 60% of the homeless mother and child population. So it's a big chunk.
Sean, you're no longer floating around the island, but you're extremely active. The floating hospital is probably more active, serving more people than ever. We talked about the scale of the problem. What's the scale of this organization?
For us, we are focused on the absolute poorest population in New York City. A lot of times the moms have the clothes on their back. The kids have enough stuff to fill a backpack. They may have a garbage bag with personal items in it, and that's the extent of what they have or what they own. So that's a common theme, not necessarily always the theme, but it's certainly a common theme within our world. We have at any given time 30,000 active patients, and we will have 60-some thousand visits over the course of a year, 60, 70,000 visits over the course of a year. And so we try to focus on keeping the kids vaccinated so they could stay in school, because we feel that school is a great option to get them out of this. And then we focus on the moms we focus on the family health, which is, I guess, the best way to put it. Instead of breaking the kids off into pediatric visits and the parents off into internal medicine visits, we take the mom and their kids together in a family practice model where the same provider sees the whole family, because otherwise you lose the mother or you lose one of the kids to the more stringent scheduling of pediatrics and internal medicine. So it's really a little bit more complicated model, but it's designed to help the families as much as you can help them in the moment that you have.
We're having a serious discussion here about very serious problems, and healthcare tends not to be the most happy-go-lucky topic. It also sounds like you're bringing hope, joy, and fun to these kids. I'll just pick out one thing that maybe is a good example, the Candy Cane Lane. Tell us about that.
Sure. Candy Cane Lane is a great story. A lot of what we do in the health education world is to make experiences available to families that don't have these experiences available. Cash is one of the things that, frankly, families rarely ever get their hands on. Candy Cane Lane started close to 20 years ago, and it started off literally with a bunch of kids in the waiting room. It was the holidays. We were talking to the moms. They were asking us, hey, does anybody have any extra toys that they want to get rid of that I can sneak to my kid on the holidays? And about 3 of us, I took 2 of my drivers with me, and we went to Toys R Us. And we took 5 shopping carts. We cleaned out.
You had some fun doing that, I'll bet.
Cleaned out the stuffed animal section. And so we were vilified.
Oh, I can imagine.
Vilified in the lines. So there we are with our carts brimming with all of these things. And these angry parents yelling at us like, what are you buying them out for? We had to go through, it was like a gauntlet to get out of there. So we got them out of there. We took them back to the clinic. And that was our first Candy Cane Lane experience. The following year, we did it more intelligently and created a toy drive. We got a bunch of people together. We kind of made it a thing. And then we decided that we wanted to teach the moms money management. So we got a bunch of Monopoly money, and we gave the moms money, and we assigned prices for the toys, because money management is a difficult thing when you don't have it. And so we were trying to explain some of those concepts and stuff. And of course, moms are moms, so they never touched any of the stuff for women at all. All that stuff was left over. And of course, they spent the money on the kids. And so we learned a valuable lesson, tossed the Monopoly money in the garbage, and said, no, we want them to have things for themselves. So the following year, we made it just simply a shopping experience. And that's what it remains today. So the moms and kids come in, and then after their visit, a volunteer takes them down to the Candy Cane Lane store that we set up. And the kids get to choose their toys. We have a variety of people that provide us with coats. It's all new stuff. None of it is used. And toys and clothes and pajamas, things that they can't necessarily afford to get. Hygiene products, of a wide scale of stuff. Every year we do the mad dash to buy hoodies just in case we don't have enough coats. So it's a combination of stuff like that. But it's a lovely time, and it just reminds everybody about the importance of being kind. Candy Cane Lane runs for a full week. This year it'll run from December 8th through, I think, the 13th or something like that.
Just so I understand exactly how the healthcare end of this is delivered, would it be fair in describing it? It's not a hospital per se where you go in and check in as a patient. It's more of a clinical model where people drop in. Is that?
Yeah, it's definitely a clinic model. So in New York State, a hospital is like a menu at a restaurant. You can pick and choose a variety of different things that you want to do. In our particular case, we have not chosen things like an operatory or an emergency room or beds. So when you don't choose those 3 items, you fall back into a hospital category called diagnostic and treatment centers. And so we're a clinic, is the easiest way to look at it. But we're a healthcare clinic that's quite comprehensive. We have mental health services, we have psychiatric services, we have infectious disease services, podiatry, We treat cradle to grave a variety of chronic illness and acute issues as well.
And you started by explaining, when we asked you to give us a lay of the land of the organization itself, saying you had treating something like 30,000 patients. But talk to us about the people that do the work, that take care of those. So how many people are we talking about? What does that look like?
It's about 200 people scattered over a main clinic site and 5 satellites throughout the city. Some of those satellites are located strategically within large family shelters, homeless family shelters. Our main clinic site is in Long Island City. That's our largest facility, and where we do most of the specialty work. Everything from dental services to optometry, all that stuff is done under our main clinic site. And there's about 200 very caring people who provide an incredibly positive experience for the families. We also pay attention to the perception of healthcare, not just the provision of healthcare. And the perception of healthcare sometimes is just as important, or if not more important. So our facility is super clean. It's bright, it's colorful, it's happy colors. The cabinetry floats on the walls so that there's no nasty schmutz at the bottom of the cabinets where the cabinets meet the floor.
I don't think that's an Irish old
I don't
Irish
think
word.
that is.
No,
I don't think that was it. I'm afraid my Jewish friends gave me those interesting and fun words.
Elaine Solak sa chambre.
Yeah. So we really make we make the perception as important as the provision. And so the families enjoy it. They're treated with respect and with dignity, and they're not in a traditional inner city clinic. They're not faced with that at all. They're faced with a very different experience.
Anybody that's a political observer of the United States right now understands that there's a lot of fear in many immigrant communities. It strikes me that you're obviously on the front line of that in many respects. How is that playing out from your perspective and your organization's perspective?
That's a difficult and complicated process and issue. And it's like a political softball in the sense that I remind people all the time that neither party has supported the provision of health care to migrants. It doesn't exist in either party. It never did. And so we were never supported by either one of them to treat the migrant populations as they flooded in from South America. We were just expected to do it, but no one was willing to write a check to support it, which is two vastly different things. So we got a lot of grief on one side of the equation to keep at it without any ability to pay for it. And on the flip side, we got a lot of threats and sticks. We'll take away your federal funding, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not an enviable position to be in, to be perfectly honest with you, because we existed before there were corporate laws in New York State. And so we're down to our roots. We're a charity. We give stuff away. So it's hard to be in that position where you are told you can't without some kind of consequence. And then, of course, trying to find the money to do it. You could charity yourself directly out of business if you're not careful. So it's not an easy world in that sense.
Sean, as we head to the final furlong here, I just want to reflect on something that you mentioned to me about a real pivot point in the organization and maybe a little bit of Irish perseverance coming to the forefront here. How 137 years after the founding of what eventually became the floating hospital, the organization hit what looked like it could have been a break point, but we're still here at the 160-year mark. So what happened to keep the ship
What
afloat?
happened? When I mentioned earlier, I came on first as a volunteer, and then I took on a very low-paying position as the head of HR, ran 2 clinics. And then going into my second year, I got a phone call from the board chairman, and he asked me to meet him and the rest of the board at a diner on the West Side. As soon as your board says they want to meet at a diner, you got to start worrying. So Off I trudged up to the west side to the diner and sat there with the board, and the board handed me a piece of paper, and it was a resignation from the gentleman that was currently running the hospital. And in the resignation was basically the model doesn't work, the charity component really isn't going to work, and it's going to pull it under. And Sean's a regulatory lawyer. He could close this and he could do it free and cheap. And so the board was faced with this. Frankly, they were tired. The endowment was gone at that point. He had already eaten through the endowment. There was nothing left from a monetary perspective. We had about a $2 million budget, and we had a $5.8 million Medicaid bad debt write-off, right? Not really the place you want to be as a CEO or a president of an organization. Those are like scary odds. And so the finance department was a gentleman named Stiles Nieri, and his deputy was Gloria Jackson, who is now my CFO. And we just said, give us 6 months, give us a shot, and let's see what we can do. And that was 22 years ago. So we dug in, and it was a tough time, actually, here. But I think it's interesting that it's the families of those that we helped.
Yeah. It's the poor, miserable Irish immigrants, descendant of the Irish immigrant, the descendant of those emancipated blacks who made sure to keep it going. Well, let's just look a little bit towards the future here before we let you do your shameless plug. What's next for the floating hospital, and is it going to float again?
Is it going to float again? Yes, we would love to float again, to be perfectly honest with you. So our last ship, the Lila, is still alive. It's on life support up in Kingston, and the Irish representatives from the Irish Business Organization and a couple people from the Explorers Club and the Teddy Roosevelt Association got together and said, hey, what if you revived the Lila or revived the ship concept? And we talked about it as like a group venture in the sense that they would jump in and use it for their own fundraising as well. Like we would share it basically as a gift to the city. And for us, it's very appealing because if you want to vaccinate 50 kids, you can struggle and outreach and try to collect the moms and get them together at the clinic. And it's an adventure, and it'd take a couple of days. If you want to get 500 kids vaccinated, all you do is say, hey, we're going out on the ship on Friday. And you'll have 1,000 kids. You won't have 500, you'll have 1,000. That's just the way it works. The ship is magical. It gets the kids out of their environment. It reminds them that there's a bigger world out there, that there's opportunity. And
there's no place to see the bigger world
than on a ship.
For New York City.
It's just amazing. Yeah, it really is. It's just amazing. It just has that effect. And of course, find me an Irishman who doesn't love the sea. They all love the beaches. They all love the sea. We all have that skin that blows up in the sun, and yet every one of us wants to run to a beach. What is that? But we all do it, and we all love it. We all feel that draw. So, of course, I want to put the boat back on the water. Foolish that I might be, but I think it's great, and I would love to try to do it.
I know a couple of guys from Saturday Night Live who might have a ferry that they're willing to unload.
They're willing to unload, of course. I'm sure they would drop it off.
We'll leave a link to what that all means for the people who aren't following that saga.
Of course.
But anyway,
that is hilarious.
Sean, really great to learn more about this organization, and I feel it's completely unique and so needed, and a lot of good work that people don't know about, so maybe we can help tell a few more people. What's your shameless plug?
So my shameless plug, wow, I had to think about my shameless plug. I think what I'm going to do is my shameless plug is ask people to look us up, and sustaining members in our tugboat society are always welcome. And it could be as little as $5-10 a month, but for us who give away food, clothes, formula, and try to keep homeless moms and kids afloat, every nickel helps. So that would be my plug.
And where do they go to do that?
They would go to www.thefloatinghospital.org, and you could put tugboat in the search line and you'll find us, or donate now.
And on behalf of our listeners, John and myself, we would like to thank Sean Granahan for telling us more about probably one of the oldest charities in the United States, whose mission continues, and its mission continues to be extraordinarily important. And at this time of year, as we enter the holiday season, and people are considering where they should donate if they've been fortunate enough to accumulate, there is probably few better options. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciated that.
We'll see you on the ship.
Awesome.
So once again, for gala tickets and other ways to support the cause, go to thefloatinghospital.org. Our next episode will be with Kwame Daniels, creator and director of North Star, an immersive theatrical experience inspired by Frederick Douglass's visit to Belfast, a show coming from Belfast to the Irish Arts Centre of New York, June 3rd through June 21st, with all the details at irishartscentre.org. Until then, we're getting ready for Fresh Stew Live.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Martin Nutty. Additional editing by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.